Welcome everyone. I'm Lawrence Kermayer. I direct the Division of Social and Transcultural Psychiatry here at McGill, and this is our Thursday afternoon speaker series, which runs under several rubrics. We have a series we call Culture and Global Mental Health, a series on culture, mind, and brain, culture and community mental health, and culture and clinic. So most Thursdays, or many Thursdays, from 3 to 5 p.m. and Eastern time, we have these talks. And these used to be live, and we're heading back toward at least a hybrid version, in which we'll try to have them live here. And some of the ones coming up, I think, in February will be in that form. But the great virtue of this Zoom method, aside from it being a little bit gentler on the planet, is that we're able to have people from all over. And so I'm very glad to see friends and colleagues from many different places online with us today. And it's my great pleasure then to introduce our guest speaker for today, Alice Bullard, who is, among other things, a historian of psychiatry and also a lawyer with JD from Georgetown Law. And at this point, in addition to her scholarly work in the history of psychiatry and colonial psychiatry and so on, she is also working in law mediation, and her interests center on mental health and in scenarios of extreme fear, trauma, and trauma-related therapies, dissociation, denial, magic, witchcraft, and witch hunts. She also works in human rights, addressing issues of extreme subjugation and contemporary slavery, particularly in West Africa. And she has a project underway in feminist legal rights and religion called Rally, Reborn Athena Legal Initiative. Maybe she'll tell us a little bit about that at some point in the presentation. So it's lovely to have Alice here. Alice has been a interlocutor in some of these this work over the years, has published in our journal important work on Henri Coulomb and the School of Dakar. And it's a pleasure to have you with us. So
thank you so much.
Over to you.
I really am just very pleased to be here, and I hope that I can provide an interesting talk. Can people hear me okay? Yes? All right. I do just want to say thank you. I published not one, but 2 of my early essays in the history of psychiatry in transcultural psychiatry. And benefited really a lot from the cohort there at McGill. And you know what? It's almost 20 years now, which is hard to believe. So my book is long in the making. Here's a little picture of it. It's came out with Routledge in part because I felt a little badly that I didn't, aim for a more prestigious press or something like that. But I just, I met the series editor, and she wanted it. So I was like, okay, that's great with me. And now it's out there in the world. It's horribly expensive book, which is all the worse because a lot of books nowadays are published open access. So I realize that the cost of the book will be prohibitive for some people, and I put the introduction online on, say, ResearchGate, and also on my page on academia.edu. So people can at least easily access the introduction. If anyone wants individual chapters, I'm happy to send you PDF versions. I don't want my book behind a firewall. I wrote it for people to read and react to. And I would trust it might be somewhat controversial in certain parts, or actually interesting for people. So I do just want to say thank you for having me. Thank you for indulging my research, and that this is the fruit of nearly 20 years of work. Not quite 20, maybe 15, 17 years of work. I did research in the archives of Senegal and France, research in the libraries of Senegal, France, and the USA, interviews with practitioners, scholars, colleagues, and friends across almost 2 decades to be able to write this book. So it's encapsulates really a lot of work. Even though the major cases in the book are all taken from published studies from Psychopathologie Africaine, which was the main journal coming out of the Fan Hospital at the University of Dakar. That journal ceased publication in the time that I was writing this book. I can't remember exactly what year they stopped publishing, but it was sometime in the early 21st century. They stopped publishing, and they started publishing in 1965. So it had a nice long run. It's full of amazing case studies. And this book that I produced it's my curated collection, let's say. You could do completely different books. I have stacks of documents that, you could write other books from. So they produce really a lot of fascinating scholarship. My acknowledgments for this book are really long. And I just want to put out there on the record that those names that I list are in no particular order. Some people alphabetize their acknowledgments or put the most important people first or something like this. I just kept going because I had no way to prioritize who was most helpful, but I intersected with really many scholars and practitioners to produce this book, and I was just delighted and stunned by the expertise, the generosity of spirit that I met with time and again. So it's been a really great experience writing the book. The material is intrinsically interesting. And so why did it take me so long? There were 2 reasons. The first was when I started the research, I was trained in, my history training is in European intellectual history and cultural history at the University of California, Berkeley, which is known for the journal Representations. And they taught us this theory of the narrative self, that the self is constituted through narration, which you find an echo of in my present book. But it was a hotbed of cultural history when I was there. And I went off into French colonial history, which was unusual at the time. And now it's all the rage, post-colonial studies. And, the focus is very much not so much on Europe anymore. But when I was doing it, I was quite the lonely individual going off into the South Seas, Melanesian islands of New Caledonia. And where I found that these French political prisoners who had been sent there died of nostalgia, which is, we would call it, I suppose, depression. But it had its own distinct sets of attributes at the time. So that's kind of how I started to get into the history of psychiatry there. And then for my second project, I was casting around and I found that no one had really worked at that time on the Fan Hospital. Although by now, Katie Kilroy-Maroc has published her book. She's an anthropologist, I think at the University of Toronto. And her book on the Fan Hospital came out a couple of years ago. It's an amazing book. And it's interesting. She's an anthropologist who ended up writing what I would call an institutional history I mean, it's very anthropological, institutional history, and then here I am, a historian, and I've written a set of case studies that really prioritize the individual and the medical. In a lot of ways, you would think those interests might have been reversed, but there you have it. So my book takes a place beside hers. And a long time ago, Didier Fassin worked in Senegal and worked on traditional healers. So that's in the background as well. But there are, lots of different scholarship. But why did it take me so long? Well, I started out researching in the Fund Hospital once I found it and found out how fascinating it was. And I ran into witchcraft. And I have to say, witchcraft threw me for a loop. And I really honestly had to say, I didn't know what to make of it. It took me a long time to come to terms with the things I was reading about witchcraft. So that was the first hiatus in writing the book. I had to do a deep study, read tons of literature, and that took me a long time to come to terms with that. The second major hiatus occurred when I decided to study for a law degree at Georgetown University. At that point, the draft of my book was already extensive, but I was dissatisfied with the kind of colonial, post-colonial frame for the narrative. It didn't seem to be putting the book together in the most powerful way. So the manuscript sat in a cupboard for many years, more or less untouched, as I pursued my law studies, and then set up and ran a human rights nonprofit at the request of a group of Mauritanian anti-slavery activists. When I returned to the manuscript with the invitation to publish in the series on health and healing in Africa and the African diaspora, my experience in Mauritania and Senegal, combined with a more highly developed perspective on mental health practices, allowed me to frame the book as it is now published. So the frame for this book is somewhat distinctive for a historian. The grand historical narratives of empire, modernity, post-colonialism, and post-modernity don't really focus my discussion. They're in the book, but they're not framing the discussion. Rather, I chose to organize the book through a collection of case studies combined with a historical frame composed of a scientific perspective. Now, what about the case studies? At a certain point, after grappling with this material for many years, I had the fundamental insight that the case studies offered the best access to the vivid sources with which I worked. They take you straight into it, in other words, without adding on things from the outside. I mean, I distinctively feel myself an outsider to these sources, and I wanted to minimize that. The high modernity of the individuals who practiced at FUN, who in the early years were Francophone Europeans for the most part, not exclusively, they imposed a historical narrative on their own work, as well as on their clients. Yet the fundamental feature of their modernist perspective appeared untenable to me, while the cases themselves spoke eloquently of ongoing search for healing and well-being. So the case studies allowed me as a historian to focus on the suffering individuals in search of healing and well-being. And a lot of history of psychiatry is focused on criticism of psychiatry. You have the whole Thomas Sass tradition, you have Foucault, you have Fanon, who said, it's politics, it's not psychiatry. So I as a historian actually think that people really do suffer. They really are seeking healing. And that comes through in my emphasis on these case studies. I'm not saying psychiatrists always get it right, but that the impulse to help people who are seeking relief from their suffering is the medical impulse. And the case studies allow that to come to the fore. So they seemed also to allow the best access for readers into the life worlds of the patients. And I think that case studies can be accessible to students as well as even to the most advanced and sophisticated thinkers. So they're kind of meeting ground that, you know, a student can read a case study because they're going to respond to the human dimension of it, even if a lot of it escapes them. So to me, they provide a kind of ground that a lot of people can come together on and consider the material. So the case studies are highly individual, and through that individuality, they are rooted in specific culture and also embodied and enduring species-wide phenomena. So it's the individual that lives in and expresses and lives through working with in a dynamic relationship with the culture. And also part of the perspective in the book is the physiological human being. And that physiology, I contend, is shared amongst all of humanity. We all have fundamentally the same physiology. And so there's that global dimension there. So the case studies provide a terrain in which students and scholars or practitioners can all engage. And I hope that that proves to be true. That was my hope. This book presents cases so as to provide material for ongoing consideration, conversation, and insights. The presentations are not meant to exhaust interpretive possibilities so much as to provide abundant material for consideration and interdisciplinary and international conversations. So the book is a departure from the historical frameworks that I inherited in graduate school. My training in history focused on intellectual and cultural history of Western Europe, the nation state, empires, colonization, decolonizations. They have provided focal points for much of that scholarship. Historical work on psychiatry, including psychiatry in colonies of European states, has focused on imperial governance, the errors and even crimes of such governance, and the processes of throwing off the yoke of European imperialism, a process that continues to this day. Instead of focusing on imperial France, decolonization, and post-colonial kind of power politics of Senegal, I chose to focus on deep time and late 20th century advances in affective neuroscience, to take that as a frame. Okay, and in this instance, for the affective neuroscience, I used the work of Stephen Porges and his so-called polyvagal theory. And I will return to what I call PVT, polyvagal theory, in a little bit. I know that that's controversial, and I'm expecting pushback from you all on indulging Porges's point of view. But so it bears mentioning that my own perspective as a historian has developed since I finished writing this book, which, you know, is almost a year ago. No, not quite. Almost a year ago that I finished working on the manuscript, other than like proofreading. So some of the works that I find very compelling at this point are, I'm going to hold this up. This Fred Speyer, Big History and the Future of Humanity. He writes from a cosmological perspective, and he's developed a historical narrative framework that takes physics, contemporary physics, as its fundamental place of finding data and creating the grounding narratives. His work caught the attention of Bill Gates and got big funding and has become I think an online course that is disseminated to a lot of secondary schools to orient people to big time. Mark Solms, this book came out recently, The Hidden Spring, A Journey to the Source of Consciousness. He appears in my book, and he is in the affective neuroscience camp, and probably considered to be a more rigorous, less easily attacked person than Stephen Porges. But I mean, I think Mark Solms is brilliant, in part for how he brings psychoanalysis into neuroscience. Really, he brings it into neuroscience, and he argues that the source of consciousness is our emotions. Well, I would tell him Auguste Comte said that in the 19th century. So what he's saying isn't necessarily new, but he's saying it was really a lot more scientific rigor than was available, previously. Certainly people in the 19th century had no concept of much of what Solms is writing about. And another book that I have read recently that is, I just think, very, very provocative and provides us all with a new way of, I took the dust jacket out, so I don't know if you can see that. This is a book that has gotten a lot of popular press, The Dawn of Everything, by David Graeber and David Wengrow. Graeber became famous during the Occupy Wall Street protests. Anyway, they also have a pretty much of a deep time framework for their studies. Let me just say explicitly what I mean by deep time. Some people call it cosmological time or geological time. It is the realization that human history is part of a long evolutionary process, that the cosmos is 13-something billion years old, that evolution has been going on for eons, and that the history of humanity comes out of the evolutionary processes. This type of historical narrative began to arise in the 19th century, but only very barely, only just. And really, most people live their lives within narratives that don't account for that. They live their lives within narratives. A lot of people live their lives within narratives provided by big world religions, that or the narrative of the nation state, or narratives about individualism, individual fulfillment. So my perspective is this deep time perspective that tries to reorient the perception of our position here on the world, on the earth. Okay, so all of these books that I just pointed out to you are post-writing of my book. I did take up deep time in my first book, which is called Exile to Paradise, that came out in 2000 with Stanford University Press. And in that book, which is focused on the 19th century, I talk about the 19th century discovery of deep time, which then was new to humanity. That the Kanak of New Caledonia were considered avatars of this deep time, which then they thought maybe went back 200,000 years. Now we know deep time is vastly deeper than that. So it cracks the historical narrative of divine creation that presumed the earth to be just a few thousand years old. And this geological time, when it first entered public consciousness, contained an impulse to inscribe non-Europeans into a prehistoric and static position. And a lot of anthropology is written from that point of view, really. And Graeber goes into that in quite some detail. So, and as I said, the documents with which I worked, for example, cast the Connacht of New Caledonia as avatars of prehistory. That type of colonial racism is the bread and butter of historians of empire, decolonization, and post-colonialism. In the books that I cited, Spire, Solms, Graeber, and Wengrow, they each adopt highly developed analyses that refuse the parochial perspective of nationalism and modernity, and view humanity within the vastly broader currents of cosmological history and evolution. So my own deep time frame for this book under discussion, Spiritual and Mental Health Crisis, is of similar motivation. The human species itself carries deep time within the body of each individual. This is not a new observation. Sigmund Freud, for example, worked from that perspective. Okay, but using it to discuss the history of transcultural psychiatry is a department from much of the historiography. Like, maybe somebody can prove me wrong, but so what about the Porges and polyvagal theory? Moving on. No, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So the case studies presented in my book are marked by the high modernism of the fond medical practitioners. Assumptions of these medical practitioners, I say practitioners because they're doctors, they're psychologists, they're social workers, so they're not all doctors. Their assumptions included, first, a dedication to what they considered scientific rationality. Second, an assumption that the historical emergence of the autonomous individual is a good and even necessary historical development. And it's a development exemplified in French history and in the emergence of French republicanism and the French civilizing process. That's a historical paradigm that has been incredibly strong, incredibly pervasive, and very much was part of the medical practitioner's outlook. Don't confuse it with my outlook. It's in their work. There's an assumption that the Senegalese patients at the hospitals had not, quote, evolved to the state of modern individualism. And there's they do a lot of writing on that topic. There's a therapeutic agenda that aimed to help patients develop themselves as rational individuals. This included, for example, leaving superstition behind and embracing a psychological perspective. There's an assumption that as reason and rationality gained ascendancy, that irrationality would fade away. That's what part of the modernist assumption, that we're all going to become rational. So, and they're working from a psychoanalytic perspective that's Freudian and Lacanian and dominated by the theories of the Oedipal complex as a mode of individual development. That's their model. Now, these are, just to be clear, again, these aren't premises that I necessarily share. Rather, as you can read in my book, the persistence of the irrational is carried in our physiology. So the further framing devices of my book include global and globalization, which actually, is part of the title, Globalizing Senegal. In what sense do I mean globalizing or global? First of all, they're the species-wide characteristics of humanity, that is the physiological, that I insist upon. There's self-government in our era of crisis. Here I'm citing the famed environmental historian who's at Georgetown, McNeil, that there is indeed now something new under the sun. And the something new under the sun is humanity's unprecedented growth, 8 billion people currently and counting, combined with poor governance, so that the foundation of our existence, that is the very living earth, is threatened. So this question of self-governance is posed very acutely for our time. We're thrust into perennial crisis because of poor governance. The technological developments and physiological dysregulation are part of the global urbanizing moment. And the unprecedented mixing of populations and cultures, again, a feature of our globalizing era. The folkloric as a vital dimension to the global. And that is a point that maybe is less talked about in broader scholarship, but it's central to my book, that the magico-religious worldview has not died out, as the celebrated founder of sociology, Max Weber, predicted, but rather persists, and that as we can grow our common humanity by learning the specifics of folkloric cultures. And part of the premise of my book is that reading these accounts, I mean, yes, you might have read about witchcraft someplace, or you've heard Donald Trump make allegations about vast witch hunts and seen the collective hysteria of QAnon, but the specifics of the culture that I'm writing about are important because they are part of our global humanity. They're part of the global folkloric. And then finally, the psychological resilience of the Senegalese as revealed in the Buffet deliriant diagnosis, which makes an important contribution to global open civilization. If they have mechanisms that allow recovery from psychosis, that seems to me important for psychiatry in other places as well as in Senegal. So I just wanted to read you one little part about unreason and open civilization. Which Suleiman Bashir Diagne, in his book Post-Colonial Bergson that came out in 2019, he discusses the distinctive Senegalese contribution to open civilization as elevated by Leopold Sédar Senghor. Senghor, of course, was a Serer poet and also the first president of independent Senegal. And as he expressed what he called Black African consciousness, this is in the 1960s, he writes, the Black African who sympathizes and identifies, who dies to himself to be born in the other. He lives with the other in symbiosis. His knowing the other is an act of giving birth to himself through the other. Subject and object are dialectically confronted in the same act of knowing, which is an act of love, which the same act of knowing in French is connaissance, which is like being birthed together. I think, therefore I am, wrote Descartes. The Black African could say, I sense the other, I dance the other, therefore I am. Okay, so to help myself come to terms with the case studies that I presented in this book, I decided I really needed a framework. And it was less evident when I started the project some almost 20 years ago than when I came back to it to finish it and publish it, in which case the modernity thesis or modernity assumptions were all the more beleaguered. And so I decided to frame it in terms of affective neuroscience, and decided to use Stephen Porges's polyvagal theory to help us understand how so-called irrationality persists in intimate, daily, and ongoing human experience. Now, I'm well aware of the criticisms of PVT. And what I would say is that the level at which data is measured is relevant to particular understanding. So there are a lot of different levels of what I'm calling data. I used to use the word reality, and in rereading my book, I realize I still use the word reality sometimes. But I had a friend way back in graduate school who used to say, oh, that time-space dimension that you persist in calling reality. At any rate, you can have quantum level discussions about what is. You can have molecular level, which is the level on which psychiatric drugs operate, which is completely distinct from quantum level realities. You can focus on nerves, like Stephen Porges does, and on what some people call holons, or the whole organism, which is conscious and self-directing and reproduces. Or you can focus on a family, society, a whole civilization. So what level of data are you interested in? Porges is attacked quite rigorously for not having all of his scientific ducks in an order. But the theory that he's put out there, which I actually think is more of a paradigm than a theory, because I do think that, specific parts of it are disprovable, but that the paradigm, the physiological paradigm, and the focusing on the neural system as an origin of psychiatric disturbances is very important. Okay, so I realize Porges doesn't get it all right, but he's putting forward a very strong argument that mental health practitioners need to focus on the physiological level and need to realize that need to work against what is sometimes called the craniocentric bias. That the huge amounts of money put into researching for psychiatric pharmaceuticals are focused on the cranium, what's up here. And then a lot of trauma people focus on the brainstem, though back down here. But Porges isn't even in the brainstem. He's in the gut. He's way down in the belly and in the heart and the lungs and the sensitivity of ears, which I missed the talk on that, but I wish I had heard it. So he's not even in the brainstem in his work. And to me, that's a very powerful challenge to the status quo. And it deserves to be considered. And that is why I used it, even though I'm well aware he can be knocked about. So, you can have at it in a couple minutes. I'll be quiet. So we have the physiological paradigm in opposition to the craniocentric psychiatry. This actually resonates quite well with the history of psychiatry in France, which originated in physiology. In the early 19th century, people were opening up bellies looking for a colon that is displaced, that they thought would be the origin of mental illness. Okay, this is early psychiatry in France. And you have Auguste Comte, who, let's see if I put my marker in. I have lost my page number. Oh, wait, here we go. Page 47. We have Auguste Comte, who in the 19th century I wrote about Comte in my first book. I'm kind of an Auguste Comte enthusiast, but he in the mid 19th century, when they're developing the first psychiatric science, he said to escape metaphysical thinking that posited an indissoluble soul, Comte physicalized the self. Human nature, he explained, is not primarily locatable in the intellect. Rather, he argued for the recognition of the relations which unify the affective life, that is emotions, the affective life and the active life to the heart and to the character. Abstracting the mind from the body or abstracting the intellect from emotions vitiated that which it meant to study. Comte didn't even think that thoughts arose first in the mind. Rather, he squarely centered the instigation of thoughts in the physicality of desire and instinct. He insisted that man only thinks and knows in order to act or to love, that is, to love oneself or to love another. He wrote that humans act out of affection and think in order to act. That's the same thing that Solms writes in his pioneering book here. And I don't think Solms realized this, that Comte said this in the 19th century. And again, of course, Comte didn't have the sophisticated science that Solms has. I'm not saying that, but it's been a minor tradition. We could call it the physiological tradition. It's been a minor tradition, and I would argue it should be revitalized. So what do we have if we're taking PVT as a paradigm rather than a theory? So you have the opposition to craniocentric psychiatry. You have neuroception and the safety imperative. And Porges began his early studies studying the heart and heart patterns and what that stress reaction results in a pounding heart, labored breathing, sweating. Normally your heart has a vagal nerve brake on it, which slows its beating. So when you're under stress, that's disengaged. And then that's the first level of stress. The second level of stress is if you can't successfully deal with this first level reaction, if you can't respond to the danger that's stressing you, say you're tied up, you can't run away, then a deeper level of a stress reaction sets in via what he calls the unmyelinated vagal nerve, that is subdiaphragm, the lower part of your body. He argues that we inherited this from ancient reptilian ancestors long extinct, and that this results in feigning death, fainting, dissociation. And what he says is that this type of stress reaction can become, there are 2 or 3 dimensions I can just summarize very briefly. First of all, that it's one-time conditioning. Once you learn to have that unmyelinated vagal stress response, it happens more habitually. Secondly, whereas the first level stress response can happen several times a day, you go in and out of a stressful situation, you come out of it quite easily. With the unmyelinated, more extreme response, our physiology, he argues, has not developed a good way to bring us out of it, and people get stuck in what he would call this reptilian stress response. So when your vagal nerve is working properly, the social engagement system works. He writes repeatedly about how incredibly perceptive people are to other people's physiological state, which is their intention. He says we functionally wear our hearts on our faces, that it's prosody of voice, it's the crinkle of your eyes, the subtle smile around your face, or the nod of your head, and people are incredibly sensitive, they're attuned to this in other people, so that when you are socially engaged, you co-regulate with other people, you have successful social interactions. If you have the stress response constantly, and especially the more severe stress response, you're not able to socially engage. And that this gives rise to numerous types of disturbances of the individual that become psychiatric diagnoses. Okay. Porges, again, he insists on the inescapable physicality of life. We all have this all the time. I, for example, right now am a little bit stressed because I'm coming up on the end of my allotted time, and I haven't finished yet. So we all constantly are living in our bodies. We're all constantly either engaging or not engaging, and that never goes away. And that's why you're always going to be susceptible to the pull of the irrational. It's always there. It's always there. You might be an enlightened individual who can really control their own subtle energies. That takes incredible amounts of training and competence. Okay, you have to be some kind of an adept to do that, whether a super skilled therapist or some kind of healer. All right. So Porges rejects dominant psychiatric diagnostic categories. He sees disruptions arising from the impeded social engagement system, giving rise to a wide variety of symptoms and incapacitating practices. And he's very dismissive. He's like, psychiatry, they write the diagnoses in order to be able to bill insurance companies. He's very dismissive of that himself. And again, when the social engagement system is not engaged, your physiology, you could say, is off, but it produces a disjuncture with in your social interactions that can build and build, so that the fundamental outline, the overall outline of his work is you have physiology, you have reaction to stimulus. Say you have a bad reaction, then if you become socially disengaged and you have failed interactions, then you narrativize that. Okay. And the narratives can turn into beliefs. They can crystallize into hardcore beliefs. And so somebody who consistently has difficulty with these social interactions, they develop narratives about their whole life, or they can even be metaphysical narratives and beliefs. And once that gets root in an individual, they have little reason to trust other people. They have, it's like a cascading failure and solidification of the narrative and the beliefs that carry them further and further away from successful sociability. So that's what he puts at the center. And so what I do in my book, and then I'll be quiet, is I take the case studies, which are written from this high modernist perspective, that's psychoanalytic and Lacanian and Freudian, but also biomedical. I mean, they'll write a 30-page case study and then put at the end one line, oh, and then we gave them six electroshock treatments and a course of tranquilizers, or whatever drug they happen to use at that moment, and then that's just like one line at the end. They make no attempt to connect that biomedical with the whole long case narratives, which go into precisely the beliefs of the patients who are from various groups in Senegal: Wolof, Serer, Lebu, Dialan, and they are narratives, their narratives is what's happening inside their bodies and to their minds are narratives about witchcraft, various forms of extreme fear, persecution, magic, evil spirits. So I take the modernist psychoanalytic case studies and I present them, and then I take the PVT that Porges put out and I say, what can we get from this case study that adds to our understanding if we look at it through the lens of PVT? Okay, I will stop there and hope that I haven't bored you all too much. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Alice. But before we open it up to people's comments and reflections and questions, I wanted to ask you to elaborate just a little bit on the specificities of the Senegalese context, because a good part of what you presented here is a sort of a very general current North American psychophysiological theory of embodied experience that emphasizes, the parasympathetic nervous system. And at the same time, you're saying people have a set of understandings and knowledge and concerns about witchcraft and so on, and that's how they narrate their distress. And I guess I want to hear a little bit more, because it's one thing to say, okay, so there's their narrative, and now you're going to map that narrative onto polyvagal theory and say, oh, certain things might have happened that caused such an experience, and so on, and then it would be narrated a certain way. I guess I would like to hear you say more about how you make that transition, but also how the people in Senegal, both patients and clinicians working with them, how they would relate the narrative to cultural knowledge and understandings. And I say that from a couple of points of view. One is the extent to which a folk or local understanding of what can we say, spiritual forces or social forces or cosmological forces that are affecting people is embedded in a larger understanding of the world and the ways people relate and so on, then that sort of reinforces and sustains that way of thinking. And also because of the point you made at the end, that when you read a case study, there's this long, rich narrative of what the person is experiencing, what they think is going on, and then we treated them with the following treatment.
Yeah.
So what's behind that? What's the assumption behind that? Are these two separate things, or is all the detail of how people are understanding it sort of, only tangentially relevant to what's being treated? So anyway, I without getting into more detail and more speculation, my point simply is, can you say more about what's specific or what's distinctive or what catches your eye and when you're engaging with these stories?
I struggled with what to present for this audience, because I figured that there would be a lot of people who are Porges critics among your group. But then I thought, I don't even know if they've read Porges, because maybe he's so criticized that people don't even read him, or I didn't really know. So I figured I better present PVT. So I did, which took up the time. But the fun practitioners, it's very odd because they are famous for these case studies that they wrote that are really long and incredibly detailed, and also probably you could never do nowadays because they publish them, boom, like this, really fast. And it's hard to believe that the individuals were not identifiable, But anyway, I don't think you could do that now with privacy concerns. So they really, really were interested in understanding how healers practiced, how Marabout and local healers like witch chasers, how they practiced, what they thought. And one of the chapters of the book presents the worldview of a healer, presents his own self-description that was published by this group. And they don't make, and that goes to the different levels of what we're not going to call reality, but data. They don't make any effort to reconcile this narrative level with the biomedical. They just exist side by side. And they just don't go there. There's like no intersection. And, I think that in a way that's kind of true to life. Like you might have all sorts of speculation and be able to write really interesting stuff about a patient, but when push comes to shove, give them a drug and the symptoms subside and the patient goes home. I don't know, but that seems to be more or less how they operated. They didn't only give drugs, they clearly talked to the patients or they wouldn't have gotten the narratives. And they also had these, what they called village councils, which were supposedly egalitarian meetings in the courtyard of the hospital where people could hold forth in a kind of loose and community style way. Some version of a group therapy, I guess. So they didn't only do electric shock treatments and give them antipsychotics, Largactil. But one example is one of the first, it's not my first chapter that's substance, I think it's chapter 4, where I write about a case of impotence. Oh, it's chapter 3. The reason I'm bringing that up is because it's an easy answer for your basic question, which is how do I use PVT in relationship to their biomedical / psychoanalytic point of view? So they have this case of a man who's 60 years old, who marries a 4th wife, who's 20 years old. He already has 3 wives and a bunch of children. And he becomes impotent on his, after sleeping with his wife. After his first night sleeping with his wife, his new wife, he becomes impotent. And, I really hesitated to write about this because, as I quote in the book, on ne touche pas au père africain, I didn't think that people might take kindly to me as a white American woman writing about a Black African man's impotence. But I finally decided that, the medical perspective, unlike the historian's perspective, politicizes and allegorizes. And I wrote about impotence as an allegory in my first book, in fact, with some very powerful visuals of impotence related to the colonizing process. But from a healing perspective, it's straightforward. This man is impeded in a basic life function, and the doctors want to help him. It's an extraordinary case. I mean, he's 60 years old. He has 4 wives. He spends a lot of time in the hospital, in a public hospital. They keep him in the hospital. They put him on tranquilizers. They say 2 months of no sex. And meanwhile, they get all his stories from him. His stories are that, he's been bewitched. He's been bewitched. And he suspects his new wife and also his 3rd wife of being anthropophagic witches, that is, blood-sucking witches, which is an allegation that can get a person killed, frankly. I mean, the fond people tiptoe around that. They don't say that outright, but other sources of mine say that, and it's a serious accusation. They don't really treat it that seriously, but they find it interesting. But they come up with, as their diagnosis, neurotic phobia, and that he has transgressed a natural law of father-daughter incest. I find that a really remarkable diagnosis, because no place in Senegalese culture is there any prohibition on a 60-year-old man marrying a 20-year-old. It happens commonly. So it's a very remarkable psychoanalytic diagnosis, quasi-psychoanalytic. And Colombe is working that case in tandem with Moussa Diop, who is himself Senegalese. And they come up with this, that he's violated this natural law that prohibits father-daughter incest. And that's why he's impotent. So, and I I give the full story, and I give the story also. Ousmane Sembène, the famous Senegalese filmmaker and novelist, he wrote a novel called Hala, which is the impotence, and became a film that you can watch on like YouTube. You can look XALA, and I think it's borrowed from this case study. It comes out like 10 years after this case study was published. I think Sembène read the case, but I don't have any proof of that. I don't actually say it in writing, but it seems apparent. There's so many parallels in the cases. So I give that, and then I say, if you look at it from PVT perspective, if what happens is he has sex with his first wife, then he falls asleep. This is his marriage night with his 20-year-old wife. And he falls asleep and he has a dream that their marriage bed literally falls apart. Like the nuts and bolts fall out of the bed and they crash to the floor. And from Porges, what he says is that and I don't know if other neurologists would support this, but this is what Porges writes. He has written that the relatively active sexual position of a male impedes pair bonding in the act, but when he falls asleep, that's when pair bonding happens. So he's able to have sex, but then he falls asleep. He doesn't bond with his wife. Their marriage falls apart. The bed falls apart in his dream, and he's persecuted from there on until he takes refuge at the hospital. It goes on for years. It's quite an interesting story, but that's an example of how I take what they said, and then I look at it again, and I look at what they presented, because they present all these details. And I found this in my first book with people who are writing a lot of ethnographic detail. They often have a lot of detail that doesn't really go with their narrative. Like they put in things that then when they sum it up and they say, and it's all about this, you're like, but wait a minute, there are these other things in here that don't really fit. So I'm able to do that because they publish so much detail. And I don't think that what they say fits at all, because there's no prohibition on this type of marriage in that culture. None at all. So they just kind of make that up. And I think that the PVT perspective accounts for it much more easily. I mean, some people might say, oh, pair bonding doesn't exist. I would beg to differ. I think it probably does. Some people might say, oh, but humans don't have to do that. I would say, well, maybe they don't have to, but they certainly do. So anyway, that's chapter 3. That's one example of how I do it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's helpful in two ways. I mean, you said a bit more again about how the people at FAN themselves construct the narrative explanation. And you can see in that process a number of things going on, including importing French colonial norms, let's say, about how human beings are supposed to work, in terms of saying this is a natural prohibition against incest that's being contravened, when, as you say, in the context, it would never be seen that way. But you also said more about your own use of Porges to construct a different, alternate narrative that links things. So that's what I was hoping, to get a little more clarity on.
I didn't get into the case studies, which maybe would have provided more interesting grist for the mill. But
yeah, for those of you who are interested, anybody who's here at McGill, if you go through the library and search for Alice's name, you'll find the book, and you can download the e-version of the book at no cost. So I guess because the library subscribes to Routledge books and so on. So that's the upside of the fact they make these books incredibly expensive, and then they sell the whole package to universities. So if you have the good fortune of being at a particular university, you may have access to these things relatively easily, at least in PDF format.
That's nice to know. I'm glad to hear that. It's been a pleasure presenting. And I would love to hear you, Lawrence, go on more about a lot of these topics.
Well, I'll send you, what I was saying earlier comes from a particular preoccupation that I have right now that, of writing a series of papers on systemic thinking in psychiatry and how that helps us deal with the integration problem, because we need a way of holding it in the same framework, the same way of formulating a case. And Francis Liu and Eric Jarvis and others here have been very involved with exactly trying to develop this, a way of formulating a case in which we can include the biology as much as we understand of it at any given moment. And hopefully that's an area that keeps getting richer and we have meaningful things to say about how trauma affects people and so on, but that incorporates that with people's self-understanding and way of narrating as not two totally separate things, but things that are interacting in some ways, and that incorporates that with people's social relationships and the environment they're in. So you have those three. That's what in the past has been called the sort of biopsychosocial approach, which is useful as a placeholder, saying, okay, there are all these different facets, but which has been criticized as being a little bit empty, because beyond just listing those three things, what do we mean? So the challenge is to make it not empty, to say, here's what we mean, here's the kind of stuff we're talking about, and here's how these things actually interact, so that it's not like there's the narrative and it just sits by itself and it has its own, we can study that as circulating representations. And here's the biology and we can figure out what the nervous system's doing. And here's our social world and our institutions and what people are asking from us. But instead insisting that in a way, these are all facets of the same larger system, and they do interact in all kinds of ways, developmentally, in the moment, and we can come up with an account of that. And in a sense, we try to do that in clinical work. Those of us who are not wedded to I have a hammer. So what Eric says earlier, we have a toolkit. And so we only have 3 things we can do anyway, or 10 things or whatever. So we do one of those. And if the first one doesn't work, we try the second one. I mean, that's not a very sophisticated approach. So we like to think that we are a little more sophisticated than that. We actually try to formulate a case and think about what some of the issues are at play and then intervene based on that understanding. And the problem is that we've had this old-fashioned view of sort of humoral theory, that it's too much or too little of this chemical. That's not very adequate. And the Porges theory is maybe a step up from that, but still problematic. And there are other things like that. So we're looking for ways to try to formulate things that are more interactive. And the other thing I'll say about that is that, because you mentioned representations, and this is one of the interesting issues, one of the tools we've been using for trying to build theory around this is 4E cognitive science, which argues that cognition, thinking, feeling, all that depends on the body, and it depends on action. Because in the end, thinking and our stories are all for acting on the world in a way that we can survive and we can, reproduce and make it go forward. So if that's the case, there's a whole argument around how not everything is representational. And I incorporated this idea in a very early paper I wrote on metaphor that was called something like metaphor as or illness experience as presentation and representations. The idea that it's not all representations, is also things we do maybe without a representation, but then have consequences. And so that's helpful sort of culturally. Anyway, this, I won't go on about it, but this is what I'm working on right now with a few people. And so the idea is to take metaphor, cognitive metaphor theory and social theory and put that together in some way with the physiology, and say they're not separate. They actually are interacting in interesting ways. And that gets us away from the kind of dualism that, the real stuff that's happening is biology. And then there's this narrative stuff, which is sort of after the fact. And maybe it has political consequences, but it's not wedded to the body, which we know is not true. We know it's intimately connected to what we feel and what matters to us and how we deal with things.
And it's connected. I mean, what you are thinking also is absolutely implicated in how you perceive.
Yeah.
So that there's to consider that a one-way street, and that narrative is somehow superstructured. That to me is just not true at all. But what I wanted to ask was, civilizational sickness, I think, is a real thing. People are writing about soul nostalgia now, right? The overwhelming grief at the next great extinction and all of these, the oceans filling up with plastic. So that I think that that really needs to be, I mean, if I could, I don't, I'm not a mental health professional, so far be it from me to say what psychiatrists should do or how you could even do that, but it strikes me as a really deficient. It's a place where in the book, I talk about internal safety and external safety. Mental health practitioners work on internal safety. That's the limit of their remit, unless you can connect people with social services, in which case it's probably a referral. Like, go here and you can get housing, or you can get money to pay your rent or something. But that social dimension is increasingly precarious for a lot of people.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that. Yesterday we had a presentation from Kelly McKinney, an anthropologist who former postdoc with us, who's for many years been a climate activist, and so she presented precisely on this and on what can we do. And she's an educator, so there are some people there, including elementary school educators, and people talking about how can we help the next generations who are really going to bear the brunt of the catastrophe, to be able to go forward in a way, So the Lancet had a few years ago a whole issue on and launched a whole discussion. In fact, they have a journal now on planetary health, which is meant to push back against global health, which comes from a sort of economic language of globalization, colonial language, and instead talk in a more ecological way about the fact that we're interconnected and with very profound consequences, and how do we think about health in those terms. And it's very easy to make that argument around things like infectious disease. I mean, look what we've just lived through in terms of pandemic and so on. These are planetary health issues intertwined with the globalization issues. But psychologically, I think you pointed to the fact that we're often hampered because our tools and our conceptual frameworks are very individual, intrapsychically centered, so it's often the feeling of, okay, yes, of course, social poverty, other things make a huge difference, but that's not our remit. We'll pass it on to somebody else. But I think those of us in social and cultural psychiatry are very concerned with that, of trying to find a way to not make it an either or, and to acknowledge the profound importance of those social contexts, even if it's hard for us to, it involves political things, it involves a lot of other things that are hard for us to intervene in. So that's what we look to in all this. It's interesting also, so you talked about Dakar, that one of the preeminent cultural psychiatrists in Canada, Morton Beiser, worked there as a young, I guess he was a medical student, a resident, or soon afterward. And it was a very formative experience for him in his subsequent work in cultural psychiatry. And he has, interestingly enough, he has a paper in the Canadian Journal of Psychiatry years ago on a formulation of a case of witchcraft, where I think he's sort of applying, social psychiatric ideas to that scenario. So thank you so much, Alice. I mean, there's so many layers to this. I think many of us are motivated to go and read your book and read these rich case studies. And I think for me, it just raises this fascinating question of all the different ways with the same raw material, we could narrate this so many different ways. And, in the end, for us, practically as speaking, the question is which formulation, which narrative is actually useful, not just to make us comfortable that we know what's going on, but actually to be helpful to the patient. What's going to give them a way to go forward. And that's why often we try to work within the metaphor or within the frame that patients have, because that's going to be most connected to the realities of their social world. But I think it's just, anyway, I won't go on about it, but thank you so much.
I would keep talking about it too, but I think we should stop.
Yeah. So thank you all, and enjoy your evening, morning, midday, wherever you are in the world. Okay, take care.